Hello there, this is John Franquez, and guess what? My AC is still busted. This is just a couple of hours after my last video that I'm doing this, and it started raining. I had to come indoors, but anyway, we are on our next president, the fifth president, James Monroe. And James Monroe had quite a career. Listen to this. Member of Continental Congress, U.S. Senator, Minister to France, Governor of Virginia, Minister to France and England, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and President. He became president for 2 terms. The funny thing is this. Back then, there were no popular votes yet. It was all electoral votes. Yet, Monroe won 2 terms. And in his second term, he won 231 electoral votes. And his opponent won 1. Monroe was almost voted in unanimously. And here's the amazing thing. Nobody liked James Monroe. He was like a dry piece of toast. However, Monroe was known for his honesty and his integrity. So, boys and girls, be honest. Anyway, he was born in Virginia, and guess what? All the presidents up to this point have been born in Virginia except for John Adams, who was born in Massachusetts. There's some kind of Virginia mafia going on here. Monroe participated in the American Revolution. He was only 18 years old. If you ever look at the painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware for the Battle of Trenton, you'll see Washington standing like on one knee. Next to him is an 18-year-old James Monroe holding the American flag. Well, by the way, it is hot in here, I'm sorry. Washington is not going to stand up on a boat in the middle of the river when it's freezing. He's sitting there freezing his butt off. And Monroe wasn't even in the same boat as Washington was. So disappointedly, it was a nice story, but it didn't happen. However, Monroe was very brave. And in the Battle of Trenton, he got hit by a bullet right here in his shoulder. And it burst an artery, and he almost bled to death. Surgeons managed to save him. I mentioned his itinerary. He became a senator, and he became minister to France under George Washington in later years. However, this is what happens when young people are very idealistic. These young people that came out of the American Revolution, Hamilton was very young, Jefferson was very young, Washington was the sage. He was in his 40s during the American Revolution. When Washington became president, he was older. But these young guys are still idealistic, and they looked at the American Revolution as something that was going to change the world. France was one of the most powerful nations on earth, and they figured if France can have a revolution, everybody can have a revolution. So when France was going through this turmoil, Monroe, who was still young at the time, was looking at it with interest. He was like, yes. And he managed to save Thomas Paine, an American, get him pulled out of a French jail. Thomas Paine started writing bad things about George Washington, who believed in a centralized, strong government, and Washington was very angry. Washington had Monroe recalled, brought back to the United States. Anyway, Monroe did marry. He married Elizabeth Monroe, of course. She became Elizabeth Monroe. They had 3 kids. One of them died young. As you sense this little pattern, people died young in those days. It was not uncommon. They had 2 daughters that did grow into adulthood. Now, Monroe had several political positions. He did become president finally. And while he was president, his wife didn't. It was hard for her to follow Dolly Madison because Dolly was so popular and vivacious, and Elizabeth Monroe was kind of stoic and reserved. She also had some kind of health problems. However, the Monroes helped restore the White House. Remember I mentioned in the last video how the White House was burned. The capital, Washington, D.C. was destroyed. The White House was totaled and looted. Monroe made it a personal mission to save the White House, and he got Congress to send money over, and he actually dished out money out of his own pocket to help restore the White House. Okay, while Monroe was president, they called it the era of good feelings. Like things were pretty good, even though there was a depression at the time because of the economic problems they had after the War of 1812. But things were generally pretty good. But there were some things that did happen during Monroe's administration. One of them was that Seminole Native Americans were coming from Florida, Spanish Florida, and attacking our territory in Georgia. Monroe sent General Andrew Jackson to take care of the problem. Jackson actually invaded Florida, went in there and hung 2 British officials who he blamed for causing this. Now, this was a serious problem for President Monroe that Jackson would have done this. But his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, that's John Adams, the second president's son, who was Secretary of State, went over there. And in the negotiations, something came out of it. Florida became, Spain pretty much ceded the territory, so does Florida, and Florida became another state. Now, some other things I should mention. They had two daughters, and the daughters would often be the hostesses at the White House because the wife, Elizabeth, was often, ill. So daughter Eliza, they called her, Eliza would often host in the White House, but she had a very mercurial temperament. She was kind of like, I don't know, bipolar or something. So eventually she left. Her sister Maria would often host at the White House. But anyway, Monroe would tour the United States, just like George Washington did. Another event that happened during his presidency, the Missouri Compromise. What is the Missouri Compromise? Well, Missouri was going to become a state, but slaveholders wanted Missouri to be a slave state. Free states wanted Missouri to be a free state. This caused a crisis, which shows you the tension that was going on between the free and slave states. A compromise was reached. Luckily, Maine wanted to become a state as well. So everybody said, okay, Missouri can be admitted as a slave state. Maine can be admitted as a free state. Problem solved for the moment. I mentioned the White House. I have to say that Monroe, for some strange reason, would dress like the people dressed during the Revolution. Now remember, the Revolution was since 1775. We're here like past the 1820s. This guy is still dressing like they dressed back in the Revolutionary days with wigs and all of this sort of thing. He insisted on doing this. A couple of funny stories. One time, the British minister and the French minister at the White House, in a White House dinner, they got angry. They were going to have a fight, and they pulled out swords. I guess back then you could go into the White House with a sword. They were going to fight. President Monroe pulls out his sword, and he stops the fight. Another quick incident, Monroe was in his office working, and somebody came in and said, hey, I got all these, applicants here. Sort of like applications for employment kind of thing was going on. And he wanted, Monroe to look at these and approve a few of these. And Monroe said, just leave it right there. I'll get to it when I'm ready. Well, the man got very angry, and he says, well, are you going to approve any of them? Who are you going to approve? And Monroe said, none of your damn business. Well, the guy actually pulled out some kind of club to attack the president. The president went to the fireplace, pulled out a fire tongue, and chased the guy out of his office. This was back in the day. What can I tell you? But anyway, one of the important things I do have to mention while he was president is the Monroe Doctrine. I can't stress the importance of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, what is the Monroe Doctrine? The Monroe Doctrine was something which was actually written by the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. The Monroe Doctrine was a document that Monroe signed as president, telling the Europeans that any colonization in the Americas, be it South America or the Caribbean, would be considered an invasion of the United States. So he was telling the Europeans, stay away. Don't mess with us. And this Monroe Doctrine was used many, many times to keep the Europeans away from the U.S. territory or any territories nearby. Case in point, in the 1980s, the Monroe Doctrine should have been used, but wasn't. Why? Well, the little Falkland Islands off of South America, the Argentinians claimed that, and they actually invaded those little islands that belonged to Britain. Britain sent ships along. The U.S. wanted to impose the Monroe Doctrine and tell England, don't do that. But Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Britain, said, we're getting our land back. The U.S. stepped back. I guess they decided, you know what? We don't want to fight with the British. So they didn't go for it. But that's just a quick example of the Monroe Doctrine and how the U.S. can choose to use or not use. All right, now, Monroe's daughter, Maria, that's the other daughter, she was the first daughter to marry in the White House. It was the first White House wedding. And after his second term, I guess he could have been elected again. He was so popular somehow. He retired. Now, after he retired, he had money problems. Some of it had to do with money that he did invest in the White House, and he was in battle with the Congress trying to get some money back. That didn't quite work out. But he retired, and while he was in his home, his wife, Elizabeth, had a seizure. and she fell into the fireplace. Got very, very badly burned. 4 years later, she passed away. Monroe was so disheartened he couldn't really be in the house anymore, so he moved. He went over to live with his daughter Maria, and he stayed there, and pretty much he died there. Now listen to this. He died on July 4th, 1831. This is, let's see, 5 years after Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on July 4th, 1826. Monroe is the third president to die on our Independence Day. So anyway, pretty much that is the administration of James Monroe. And I want to hear your feedback. So comment below, or better yet, subscribe. And stay tuned for our next video on John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams. One of the most unpopular presidents we've ever had. We're going to be talking about him. But until then, sayonara.